Hi friends, this is Prasanjit and I welcome all of you in Mule 4 Learn from D. Today we are going to discuss about controlling the levels of exception handling in Mule 4. So before going to the demonstration, I would like to show you 6 thumb rules of exception handling in Mule 4. First, we need to remember that once an exception happens, the control never executes next event processors of that flow. Alright, so the first point is once an exception happens, the control never executes next event processors for that flow. Second is, by default for HTTP listener, success response is status code 200 where we get the body as payload. Okay, for error response the status code is 500, body is error.description. Alright, this is for HTTP listener specific configuration. Third one is, because we are going to use HTTP listener in our demonstration, that's the reason I have placed it here. Third point is, on error propagate throws the error to upper level. Alright, here upper level means, suppose I have called a child flow from the parent flow. So in case there is some error in the child flow and we are handling that error using on error propagate, right? In that case the error would be rethrown to the upper level, that is, here the upper level would be the parent where from the call was made to the child flow. Alright, in case of on error continue, it doesn't rethrow the error to the upper level. Alright, so its result is success response. So we need to remember that for on error propagate, the result is error response after processing all its event processors, and in case of on error continue, the result is success response, and also that is after processing all its event processors which are mentioned in it. We will see it in brief once we start the demonstration. Alright, so before that let's go to the point number 5. So rule 5 is, if a mule flow contains at least one flow level error handler, if a mule flow contains at least one flow level error handler, then it is out of scope of the Mule application level error handler, which is the global error handler. Alright, so whenever we talk about global error handler in Mule 4, that time we need to understand that it is Mule application level error handler. Alright, hence global error handler is for those flows which don't have flow level error handler configured in it. Alright, so we need to remember these rules so that we can understand the behavior of error handling, the ways of error handling in Mule 4. Sixth rule is, any unhandled exception in Mule 4 is ultimately handled by Mule default error handler. Alright, these are the 6 thumb rules of exception handling in Mule 4. So before going to the demonstration, I want to show you Mule default error handler is the parent of all. Alright, it is parent of all. Then we have at second level we have 2 error handlers. First one is flow level error handler. If an error is not handled by any of the error handler which are mentioned below, then that will be handled by Mule default error handler. Alright, so now we can see that at the second stage there are 2 error handlers. One is flow level error handler, another is application level error handler. Alright, and I have mentioned it as OR. The reason behind it is an exception can be handled either by flow level error handler or application level error handler if we want to handle them using flow level or application level error handler. Alright, so the significance behind this statement is like, in case we put any flow level error handler in our flow, in that case the flow level error handler will try to handle the exceptions which are raised or which occurs in that flow, right? In case a raised exception or an occurred exception in a flow is not handled by flow level error handler, though we have mentioned a flow level error handler, in that case it will directly be handled by Mule default error handler. Alright, so it will not go to the application level error handler. Alright, so global error handler is for those flows which doesn't have any flow level error handler mentioned in it. Alright, so now if we come to the stage 3, there is event processor level error handler. Alright, so whenever we mention any error handler at processor level, that we call it as event processor level error handler. Alright, let's go back to the studio, Anypoint Studio. Okay, so for demonstration purpose, we are going to use 6 parent flows and 2 child flows to cover most of the scenarios for exception handling in Mule 4. Alright, we will see that one by one. So before starting the demonstration, I want to show you the global error handler and Mule default error handler. We need to understand that it is the default error handler and it is implicit. Alright, we cannot configure Mule default error handler. If an error is not handled by any of other error handlers, then that will be handled by Mule default error handler. Alright, so we will see flow level error handler. First we will see application level error handler, then we will come to flow level error handler, and then we will see event processor level error handler. Alright, I am going to show you in the flow how I have configured that. Alright, let's move ahead. So friends, this is my Mule application, which is exercise-2. Alright, it is having 3 Mule configuration files. One is global configuration file, which is having global configurations as well as, so this is global configuration, and here if you see, I have mentioned global error handler. So this is the global error handler, which is mentioned as global configuration file error handler. So this is the error handler. I have placed it here in the global configuration file. Also, the global configuration file is containing other configurations, that is the HTTP listener configuration, HTTP request configuration, HTTP request configuration for third party service, then validation configuration, which I have used in the demonstration. So that's the reason I have placed it here. Also the configuration, this is the one which actually tells our Mule application that it is the application level error handler. Alright, so from here we need to mention that this is the error handler we are going to use as our application level error handler. Alright, so this is the global error handler and the global error handler is at application level. Alright, now I will show you the parent flows. I have mentioned that we are going to use 6 parent flows to demonstrate the error handlings in Mule 4. Alright, and there will be 2 child flows also. So these are the parent flows which I am going to use one by one to show you the error handlings in Mule 4. Also, I want to show you that these are 2 child flows which I am going to use, and for subflow I have placed it intentionally. I want to show you that subflow doesn't have error handling section. Okay, so this is as we are talking about error handling in Mule 4, so subflow will not come in this picture. Okay, so it is out of scope. I'm just going to hide it. Alright, okay, so let me show you the child flows one by one. So this is the child flow, and I have used HTTP listener to receive the request from the parent, and then I have used simple event processors to just update the payload, and also I have used raise error to intentionally throw some error. Alright, and here these are the error handling on error continue I have used here for public flow B, which is child flow. So I have used on error continue, and I want to tell you that the type is mentioned as here, it is mentioned as any. Okay, So you need to remember that any is the parent of all error type. Okay, so in Mule, any error we define it as their namespace and identifier. All right, so namespace and identifier, through this information we actually identify any error. All right, any is the type. Okay, so if we just click here and if you see, this is the any is the parent of all type of errors in Mule. All right, so I have mentioned any, so that means it will handle all kind of error which can occur in public flow B dash child. All right, so in this flow, whatever error occurs, it will be able to handle that. All right, and it will behave as per the error handler which we have mentioned here. That means on error continue, it will behave as per the behavior of on error continue. Similarly, let's just hide the public flow B, which is the child flow, and now I want to show you the private flow C, which is also a child flow. All right, so now if you see, private flow C is a child flow and it is not having any source, so it is a private flow. All right, so whenever a flow doesn't have anything in their source section, then it is called as private flow. All right, I have mentioned it and I have also explained this in other tutorials. So if you want to go through them, then please go through the other video. Okay, so now here also I am doing the similar kind of activities like updating the payloads, and also deliberately I am going to throw exception using raise error. Okay, so raise error component, if you just in the Mule palette, if you just type raise, then you will find that raise error component is there. If you follow my cursor, this is the raise error component. All right, event processor. So now here in the private flow C, which is a child flow, in the error handling section, I'm going to handle the error using on error propagate. All right, so using on error propagate, I'm going to handle the exceptions which are there. And here if you see, I haven't mentioned any kind of type. So whenever, let me tell you that whenever we don't mention any type, that time it actually considers it as any. All right, so mentioning any as a type, or if we don't mention any type, these two means the same thing. All right, so whenever we do not mention any kind of type, error type in the error handler section, that is on error propagate or on error continue, that time it consider it as any. All right, if you see, there are two sections. First one is in this, if you follow my cursor, in the on error propagate configuration, we have two sections, type and when. So basically these are two placeholders where we actually mention type of error, and also we can mention some condition based on which the error handler will work. All right, so in case we mention both the type and when, in that case type would be taken as top priority. Type value would be given as top priority compared to when value. All right, so if we mention both type and when, type is the precedence, type is given precedence. All right, these are the details I wanted to show you for the child flows. Now let's move ahead to the parent flow. All right, so before that I want to expand this. Now these are the public flows. So parent flows, these are the parent flows using which we are about to demonstrate the error handlings. All right, so I will just expand each and every flow and one by one, and then I will send a request, and then we will see how the flow actually behaves. All right, so now I have just expanded the parent flow, which is public flow W. All right, which is public flow W. So I am going to call the public flow W using Postman. I'm going to use Postman as a client, as a REST client. All right, and now here these are the configurations I have used. This is the called third-party service. This is the URL I have mentioned it here, and also I showed you that there is some validation configuration I used. So here in the validate configuration, I have used this expression. All right. So if this expression is true, then if this expression is true, then it will throw some it will throw the error. All right. Basically, this component here in the parent flow, we are going to call a third party service, and from there we are going to receive the response, and we are going to validate the response based on this expression. And here if you see, I have used size of function. All right, in Mule for data wave we have size of function using which we can actually calculate the size of a collection on array. All right, using this expression we are actually validating the response. So in the received response there will be some field, there will be data, and then we are calculating if the size of data is, this data is basically one array, and if the size of that array is equal to 7. All right, so if the size of that array is 7, then it will not throw any error. In case the size of array is not size of data array is not 7, in that case it will throw error. All right, this is how that validation component actually works. And in case it throws some error, in that case it will throw this, it will show this message as error message. All right, it will put the message in the error description section. All right, so now let's move ahead, and I am going to make a request from Postman to this parent flow, which is public flow W. All right, let me just copy the URL from here. So this is the first one. So I already deployed the code, and the debugger was already started. So now if you see, the debugger is at the first event processor in the parent flow. All right, so now we will see. This is the event which has been created. This is the attribute section, this is the payload, and this is the variable. All right, so we can see, as this was a get method, this was a get request, that's the reason payload is not there. So we are going to call third party service using the HTTP request component. All right, so now we are going to call the third party service. Here if you see, this is the payload which has been returned as a response. Now we are going to see if the size of payload.data is 7 or not. So it is showing as 6. All right, so it is showing as 6. So whatever validation expression we mentioned here, it is not true. That means it is going to throw an exception. All right, so this component is going to throw an exception. And now if we move ahead, we will see that there is going to be an exception. Now if you see the event, current event structure, there is no error object. All right, so just we are going to move ahead. Now if you see, this is an error has occurred. And what is the error? If we go inside the error section, then we will see that the error description is showing as showing the error message which we set there in the validation component. All right, and what is the error type? Any error we can know it as per is based on its namespace, which is this one. So validation is the namespace, and the identifier is invalid boolean. All right, so the component has returned an exception. Now let me tell you that whenever an exception happens, based on our thumb rules, it should, whenever an exception happens, once an exception happens, the control never executes the next event processors. Alright, so that means here after validation, whatever components are there, they will never be executed. Alright, so the control will directly go to the error handling section, and if there is any error handler mentioned, then it will go to there. Alright, so here for our flow, for this parent flow, this public flow W, we have one error handler which we have mentioned here. So this one is on error propagate. Alright, so on error propagate, how it actually works. On error propagates, this on error propagate rethrows the error to upper level. So the thing is that the behavior of on error propagate is it executes the event processors which are there inside it, and also it logs the error. It executes the event processors which are there, and then it rethrows the error to the parent level. Alright, so now if we just move ahead, and we will see that the control will come here in the on error propagate section. Alright, so now if you can see, this has come to the on error propagate section, and let me tell you, though the type of the error was validation, and the namespace of the error was validation, and the identifier was invalid boolean, still it has come here because I have mentioned that I already mentioned you that in case we don't mention any type in any error handler, that time it consider it as any. Alright, that's the reason it has come here. So for any kind of error, this will come here for this parent flow. Alright, because we haven't mentioned anything. So whenever we don't mention any type, that time it consider it as any. Okay, as type any. So now we are going to see what happens. So if you can see, this is the error type is this, and this is the error description. And now let me tell you that whenever an error is handled using on error propagate, that time it executes the event processors which are mentioned inside it, and then after the execution of all its event processors, after the execution of all its event processors, it actually rethrows the error to the upper level. So here, in case of our public flow W, what is the parent for this one? Where from the call came? The call came from the postman, right? So again, what will happen after processing the logger component? It will actually throw the error. Alright, so the error response would be returned. So the result would be an error response, right? And by default, if you see, by default the HTTP listener, so in this case the request was received using HTTP listener in the public flow W, and that is parent, right? So now on error propagate will rethrow the exception to this listener. Alright, so to this listener an error response would be returned, and if you see, for the error response the status code is 500, and the body would be what? Body would be the error description, error.description, right? So whatever is currently there in the error.description, so this part, so this will be the body of the response. Alright, so now if we just move ahead, we will see that this will be the body of the response. So now we will see that this is the response which has been returned, and this is the status code. Alright, so we have successfully run the first demonstration, that is whenever an error occurs in a flow, that time the next event processors are never executed, and the control is directly goes to the error handling section, and if there are any error handler mentioned, in that case it executes the event processors which are mentioned in that error handler. Alright, now I will hide this public flow W, and we will move ahead to the next flow. So now let's move ahead to the public flow. parent. Okay, so before that let me tell you that here we have handled in the public flow W, we have handled we have placed the error handler on error propagate at flow level. All right, so this is the flow level error handler for public flow W dash parent. All right, this is how we configure flow level error handler in Mule 4. Now let's move ahead and we'll see that the processor level error handler. All right, so here in public flow Z, which is a parent flow, here if you see I have placed the HTTP request component, that is the event processor. I have placed it in try catch block, right? In try block I have placed it in try block. If you see, if any error happens in HTTP request, all right, so if any error happens in case in HTTP request component, that would be first handled by the processor level error handler, where I have mentioned on error continue and type I have mentioned it as HTTP connectivity, right? Now we will see, so type I have mentioned it here HTTP connectivity, and we will see what kind of error actually happens, right? So let's move ahead and I am going to send the request using Postman. So now if we see, the breakpoint is already the breakpoint is showing, and it is hit by the request. Now if we move ahead, let's see what happens. So now using this HTTP request component, I am going to call a flow which doesn't exist, all right, which doesn't have any existence. So what will happen, it will throw some exception. So now if you see, using this I am going to call this flow, which is HTTP localhost 8081 and the flow not exist, right? So this is the URL I am going to call using HTTP request. Let me show you that this flow does not actually exist. What was the flow name? It is flow not exists, right? If you see, there is no listener and it is showing as 404 not found. All right, now let's see what happens in case of HTTP request when we are trying to call the same service using HTTP request from our public flow Z, which is a parent flow, right? Let's move ahead and we will see that, and we see that there is some exception because the flow doesn't exist. Now if you see, it is also showing the same response, that is HTTP not found. All right, and it is the description. I already mentioned you that in case of whenever any error happens, that time an error object is generated, and based on that error description is shown and also the error type. All right, so here if you see, the error type is HTTP colon not found. That means the namespace is HTTP and the identifier is not found. But in case if you see the error handling section of try block, there I have placed one error handler, that is on error continue, and the type is mentioned as HTTP colon connectivity, right? But this is not matching with our current error type, right? Whatever error has happened, it is not matching with that. That means the processor level error handler is not going to will not be able to handle the error which has occurred because the type is not matching, right? So we will see that whenever the error handler which are mentioned in the try block is not able to handle the error which has occurred, it will be again thrown to the flow level, right? So from the processor level it will be thrown to the flow level. All right, so let's see. Let's move ahead. Now see that the try block is now showing an error, right? The try block itself is showing an error. In case we would have handled the exception using the error handler which we have mentioned in the try block, then the try block would have already handled the exception, right? But right now, as we were not able to handle the exception using the error handler which we have mentioned, because the type didn't match, right? The whatever the type we have mentioned in the on error continue error handler, that type is not matching with the error which has happened, right? So that's the reason it is getting rethrown to the parent level, right? So this is the behavior of the Mule default error handler, right? So whenever an error handler is not able to handle the occurred error, that time it is handled by Mule default error handler, right? So Mule default error handler actually logs the error details, and then it rethrows that to the upper level, right? So now from the processor level, the error is about to be thrown to the flow level, right? So now a flow level component, which is the try block is showing an error, right? So now we can see that the payload, whatever the payload was there, so there is no payload and error. And now if you see, this is the component and it is showing it as there is some error, right? Now let me tell you that for this flow we don't have any flow level error handler, right? So whenever there is no flow level error handlers, let me go to our thumb rules. So here if you see, if a Mule flow contains at least one flow level error handler, then it is out of scope of the application level error handler, that is the global error handler, right? So hence global error handler is for those flows which don't have flow level error handler configured in it. So here if you see, we don't have any flow level error handler configured. For public flow Z, right? So for public flow Z, we don't have any flow level error handler. So now as per our thumb rule, it should be going to the global error handler, right? So in the global error handler, I have put breakpoints there in each of the event processors in the error handlers. All right. So now here in the global error handler, if you see the type, the first one is mentioned as Mule expression. So this is the type of expression. The exception type, I have mentioned it as expression. And the second one is on error continue, and it is showing the type as any. That means, so what was the type of our error? Our type of error was HTTP not found, right? So that means the first element, that is on error propagate, actually whatever error handlers we mention in the global error handler or in the any error handling section, whatever error handlers we mention, it actually tries to execute them one by one from top to bottom, right? So first it will try to execute the first one and it will check if the type is matching with the actual error occurred. All right. So as our error which has happened is HTTP not found, but the first error handler in the global error handler is of type expression. So this one would not be executed. It will not be executed. So the next one is of type any. That means our error would be handled by this error handler, that is on error continue, and the type is any. All right. So if we just move ahead, we will see that the control will go there. All right. So let's move ahead. So here if you see, it has come to the on error continue, and where we have mentioned it as type any. All right. So now let's see that if we have received any response here in postman or not. If you see, we haven't received any response because our flow execution is not yet complete. Now if we just move ahead, we will see that, see here we need to understand that it is on error continue which is handling our exception in the global error handler, right? So what is the behavior of on error handler? On error handler, let's just go to our thumb rules. That is on error continue does not read through the error to upper level. That means it will not read through the error to the upper level, and it will result as success response. And in case of success response, what is written? Status code is 200 and the body is payload. We need to look to this part. Body would be the payload. All right. Now here also it is going to send the response after processing all its events, right? So here if you see, we have used a set payload component and it is going to update the value, update the payload with this. All right. So after this execution of this set payload component, the control will go to where? The control will go directly to the caller, right? So here we will receive the response in the postman, right? Because the error is being handled here, and here the flow would be complete, right? So now let's move ahead and I will click here. So now let's see, as you can see, this is the payload which has been returned as the response, and also the status code is 200, right? So we have seen that whenever there is processor level error handler, that time if a component is having processor level error handler, that time that exception for that component, any error, if any error happens to that component, that is first Mule tries to handle that error using processor level error handler first, and if that processor level error handler is not able to handle that, then it will read through it to the upper level, that is the flow level, right? So if we talk about the levels, then the processor level is the granular level, we can say, and the upper level to the processor level is the application, the flow level, and then the upper level of the flow level is the application level, and also the upper level of all is application level, and flow level is the Mule default and error handler, right? Also we have seen that whenever a flow is not having any flow level error handler mentioned in it, in that case, that any error in that flow is handled by the global error handler. Okay, so global error handler is used in case when there is no flow level error handler mentioned for a flow. All right, so here if you see, we don't have any flow level error handler for public flow Z, which is a parent flow, right? That's the reason it was handled by the error which was occurred at the flow level, that was handled by global error handler, right? So this is our second flow. We have seen how it behaves. Now let's move ahead to the third flow. All right. So I'm going to send a request to the third flow. Now let's see, there is the breakpoint at the first event processor in the public flow Y, right, which is a parent flow. So now we will try to call a private flow using flow reference. All right, so using flow reference we are trying to call private flow C, and we will see the result. All right, and if you see, we don't have any error handler for public flow Y at the flow level. All right, so we don't have any flow level error handler for this flow. Let's move ahead, and we will see that the control will go to the child flow. Here, if you see, this is where currently the control is, the debugger is. All right, let's move ahead, and we will see that we are going to deliberately throw an exception using raise error. Now an error has been raised, and if we see, the type of the error is custom error, right? So this is the custom error message. This is the type which I have mentioned, and this is the description which I have mentioned there. All right, so now let's see what happens. So can you tell me what will happen if we just move forward? So here for private flow C, we can see that there is flow level error handler mentioned, which is on error propagate error handler. So what is the behavior of on error propagate error handler? It executes all the event processes which are there in it, and then rethrows the error to the upper level, right? It then rethrows the error to the upper level, and what is the result? Result is error response. So now if we just move ahead, and we will see that the error is getting handled by the flow level error handler, which we have configured here, and we will see that the payload is now updated with the set payload component in the on error propagate. All right, so now though we have updated the payload, but we know that for on error propagate, it actually rethrows the error to the parent level, right, to the upper level. So here which is the upper level for private flow C, where from the call came. The call was made from parent flow, which is public flow Y, right? So once the on error propagate of private flow C rethrows the error to parent level, then it will come to here, then it will come to the flow reference component to the public flow Y, which is the parent where from the actual call was made, right? Let's see. We'll just press F6, and now we need to remember that this is the current description of the error, and we are going to move forward. And now you can see that the flow reference component itself is now throwing an error, right? Because in the child flow, which was an private flow, so in the child flow we used on error propagate, and when it rethrown the error to the parent level, then it came to the parent, and where from which component we did the call, that component is now throwing an error, right? We will see the error description, which is the same one which we saw for child flow, and now this is the type, right? And now if you see, for public flow Y, parent flow, for this one we don't have any flow level error handler. That means where the control will go now, it should go to the global error handler, right? And also this time we have the type as custom error. That means custom is the namespace and custom error is the identifier, right? And this is not matching with the first error handler type. So whatever type we have mentioned in the first error handler of global error handler, so there the expression type is not matching with the current one, right? So again this is going to be handled by the next error handler, which is on error continue in the global error handler, right? So now let's move ahead and we will see that the control will come here. See, it has come here. And what will be the response now? On error continue. Here we are handling the error using on error continue. That means this component will update the payload, and whatever payload would be updated, and on, as we know that on error continue sends the success response. Let me go to here. So on error continue, what it sends? It doesn't throw the error to the upper level, also it sends success response, right? So it will again, for this case also we are going to receive the success response, and the payload is going to be on error continue message, whatever payload we have set here. So this is the payload we are going to receive in our postman, where from we did the actual call, and also the status code is going to be this thing, right? So let's move ahead and we'll see that we'll receive the response. So now let's go ahead, and if you see, this is the response we have received, and this is the status code, which is 200. All right. So now we have seen whenever an error occurs in the child flow, and if that error is not being handled properly there, or if we handle that error using on error propagate, that time the component where from we did the call to the child flow, the error from the child flow is rethrown to the caller component, where from caller component in the parent flow. So in this case, this was the flow reference using which we called the child flow. So when the on error propagate from the child flow rethrown the error, that time as a result flow reference component was throwing the error at parent level, right? And as we didn't have any flow level error handler for public flow Y, that's the reason it was handled by global exception or global error handler in this case, right? So now this was the execution of third flow. So now let's move ahead and we will see the next flow, this one, right? So I'm going to make a request using postman. Let me copy the URL from here. Here we have used here for public flow X, which is a parent flow. For this flow we have used flow level error handler, right? So we have placed one flow level error handler for this flow, parent flow. So now the flow level error handler is having one on error continue error handler, and the type we have mentioned it as HTTP method not allowed. All right. So from here in the error handler configuration, in the type section, if we click this magnifier glass, we can see that the all kind of errors which can occur in this flow, it is all reflecting. So from there I have just selected HTTP method not allowed. All right. So now we are going to see what happens when any error occurs in this flow. So this HTTP request node is going to call public flow B, right, which is a child flow. So where is our public flow B? Our public flow B is here, right? And if you see, the public flow B is accepting only get method, right? Let me show you the listener configuration of public flow B. If we go to advanced, here we have mentioned that allowed methods is only get, right? So let me go back to the parent flow. Here let me show you that we are going to do a request to the public flow B using HTTP request, and we are using HTTP method as post, right? So what is going to happen? The child flow is not going to accept our request, and it will throw an error. Which component will throw an error? This HTTP request component will throw an error, and the type would be HTTP method not allowed. Alright, so let's move ahead and we will see that an error will occur. Right now we don't have any error in our event. See attribute, payload, variables. Let's move ahead. Now if you see, there is one error which has been thrown by this HTTP request component, and now if we go to the error type, we see that this is HTTP method not allowed, right? And now if you see, this is the type which we have actually handled at the flow level error handler, right? So if we move ahead, we will see that the debugger will come here in the set payload component of the on error continue, right? So now if you see, this is the debugger has come to the first event processor in the on error continue error handler. Now it is going to update the payload with the new value, and remember that this is on error continue. So what is the behavior of on error continue? On error continue, we have already seen it. So on error continue does not rethrows the error to the upper level. Also the result is success response after processing all the event processors in it, right? In case of success response, whatever payload is there, that is returned as the body of the response, right? So now if you see, there is no payload, and now if we move forward, we'll see that the payload has been updated with the set payload component of the on error continue, right? So now whatever payload is there at this point, this is going to be returned as response to our postman, right, from where we did the actual call, right? If you see, there is no response which has been received by our postman. So if we just complete the flow, then the response will come. Let's see. HTTP method not allowed error handled. And what is the response? What is the status code? It is 200 because we used on error continue. What would have happened in case of on error continue? If we would have used on error propagate here at the flow level, what would have happened? The payload in case of on error continue, if we use on error propagate, then the exception would be handled and the event processors, that is set payload and logger, both will be executed, but the response would be an error response, right? Because on error propagate rethrows the error to the upper level, and also the result is error response, and in case of error response, the error description is written. So in that case, in the response body, we would have received the error dot description, this thing we would have received, and the status code would have been 500. In case if we use on error propagate in place of on error continue in public flow X, which is a parent flow, right? All right, so this is how it behaves. Now let's move ahead and move to the next flow. So after public flow X, we have public flow V, right? So here, in case of public flow V, we are going to call, we are going to make a call using postman. So this is the URL I'm going to use. Now we can see that the debugger is hit by the request, and now we are at the breakpoint, the first event processor in the public flow V, right? We are going to move ahead, and now if you see here, I am going to make a request to the public flow B, and also I'm using get method, right? I'm using get method in this time. Earlier we used post method, which was not accepted by the child flow, which is public flow B. So here we are using get method, and we know that this is going to be accepted by the child flow, right? So let's move ahead and we will see what happens. So now we can see the debugger there in the child flow. We will move ahead, and now in the child flow, deliberately we are going to raise one exception, right? We are going to raise error. So here let's see what happens. So we can see that using raise error we have raised one error, and we can see that the error type is custom error, which we have configured there in the raise error. So what is going to be the next thing which will happen in child flow? So if we move ahead, the error which has been happened in the child flow, that is going to be handled by the flow level error handler, which we have mentioned here. So this is the flow level error handler. Using this we are going to handle the exception, right? So now let's move ahead, and we see that once we moved ahead, there is an exception, another exception happened, but this time it is at parent level. And what is the exception? It is HTTP timeout. What is the exception? It is HTTP timeout. So what will happen now? And let us see if we have done any error mapping for HTTP request. All right, if you see there is no error mapping, that means this error will be handled by the error handler section as whatever it has been mentioned in the type section, right? So now the parent flow is one component in the parent flow is now throwing exception. So what is going to happen? The parent flow, the exception in the parent flow is going to be handled by the exception error handlers, which we have mentioned in the parent flow at the flow level, right? But in the on error continue, the type we have mentioned it as HTTP method not allowed, right? So that means the flow level error handler, which we have mentioned, that is not handling the current error. So what is the next, how this error would be handled then? In this case, as I mentioned there, that whenever let's go to our thumb rules. If a mule flow contains at least one flow level error handler, then it is out of scope of application level error handler, right? That means if the flow level error handler is not able to handle the current error, then it will not be handled by the global error handler. It will not be handled by the global error handler. It will directly be handled by Mule default error handler, right? So this will be handled by Mule default error handler. So let's move ahead and we'll see that the breakpoints which we have mentioned in the global error handler, that will not be hit by the debugger. All right. So let's see if we have received any response. If you see, we have received the response, and that is the response which has been set by after handling the exception by the Mule default error handler. Also, if you see, this is the 500 is the error code, and the response is whatever error dot description was, that thing we have received as response. And this error was handled by this error was handled by Mule default error handler, not the global error handler, which is the application level error handler, right? And if you see there, the debugger is still there in the child flow. That means once the HTTP request node sends a request to the child flow, it also monitors if it is receiving the response within a certain span of time, right? So in this case, it didn't receive the response within the timeout within the expected timeout period, right? That is suppose if we mention the timeout as 10 seconds, if we mention the timeout as 10 seconds, and if the HTTP request component do not receive the response from the child or the called flow within the 10 seconds, then at that time it will throw the HTTP timeout exception, right? So in this case, the same thing happened. So it didn't receive the timeout, the response within the mentioned timeout period, and that's the reason it threw the exception, timeout exception. And as the error type was not handled by flow level error handler, that's the reason it was handled by Mule default error handler. So the child flow execution thread is still running. We need to complete this one, because though our caller is not waiting for any response, because it has already received the timeout response which was generated by the parent flow. So the execution of the child is still in progress, so we'll just move ahead and finish it. All right, so though we have finished it, but the response from the child is not, it doesn't matter now, because the response has been already received. All right, so to resolve this issue, what we will do is we will just go to the HTTP request node of the public flow V, which is the parent flow where from we did the call to the child. So we will go to the response section, and we will mention it as response timeout is 60 seconds. All right, it is 60 seconds we will mention. So now let's make another request to the public flow V. So we have done another request from postman to public flow V. Now we will move ahead and we will see what happens when an error is raised by the child flow. So now the error is raised by the child flow, and if we see, this is how the error is handled in the child flow at the flow level. And we know that on error continue actually sends a success response, and as part of success response, if you see, though an error was occurred in child flow, still using error continue, we handled that error, and we received one success response from the child flow to the parent flow V, right? Now let's see what is the payload. If you see, this is the error handled in public flow B. This is the payload which we have received from the child. And what is the response? Response is status code 200, because we used on error continue in public flow B, which is the child flow, right? So we need to always remember that in case of on error continue, we always receive success response, and in case of on error propagate, we used to receive error response, right? And in case of error response, the body will be the new payload, or the body would be error dot description. In case of on error continue, we will receive the body as payload, right? So now another thing we need to remember, that after we raised the error in child flow B, which is the public flow B, which is the child flow. So after we raised the error, the event processors which were there after the raise error component, those were never executed, right? So you need to remember the first, this is the first thumb rule, which is once an exception happens, the control never executes next event processors of that flow. Okay, so in this case, the error happened in the child flow, and the event processors which were there after the component which actually raised that error, so the event processors after that were not executed. All right, so here if you see, this is the payload, and we are going to update the payload using the set payload component in the parent flow. So now this is the new payload, and we also have seen that as the error was not rethrown from the child to the parent, that's the reason the next component after the HTTP request, the event processors like set payload and logger, these were all executed in the parent flow, right? So now as there is no error in the parent flow, we are going to receive success response, and the response is about to be the payload, and the status code would be status code will be 200. So now if you see, we haven't received any response yet. So now we'll move ahead and we'll see that we have received success from public flow V, and this is the status code. All right, this was like in case an error happens in child flow, how it is handled in the child flow. Based on that, the actually response is returned from the parent flow to the actual caller. All right, let's move ahead to the public flow U, which is also a parent flow, and now we are going to send a request to the parent flow U. All right, so let's move ahead, and here in the HTTP request, if you see, we haven't mentioned any timeout. That means it will use the default timeout value for HTTP request. So now we will move ahead and we will see what happens. It is going to call the child flow which is public flow B. All right, so now we have seen that it has come here, and one error is thrown by the child flow, same behavior, and it is now handled. But here if you see, the error has been generated by this HTTP request component, and the error type is HTTP timeout. Okay, so this thing we have already seen. So let's move ahead, and we see that the error, the child level execution, that thread is still running, and the parent level execution, if we go to the Mule debugger, the parent from parent and HTTP timeout response was already returned to the caller. All right, so that was the fifth flow in our demonstration. And now let's move ahead to the sixth flow, that is public flow T. All right, so we'll make another request to the using Postman. So the debugger is there at the first event processor. Now let's move ahead, and here we are going to use this HTTP request component to call the child flow. So now the child flow, the control is there at child flow, and we are moving ahead, and in the child flow an error is raised, and this is being, though the child flow, that debugger is still running, though the child flow is still executing, but as the request attribute HTTP request, the whatever the timeout, default timeout value, as this has been reached by the execution of the I mean, within that timeout value, we haven't received the response from the child flow. That's the reason the HTTP request node has raised one timeout exception. So now if we see, the error has been error is the one timeout exception is actually raised. If we see the description, this is the timeout exceeded, but in this time, and this time the type is showing something different. Why is it so? Because this is showing as custom custom error. So why is it showing this? Because we have done an error mapping in the component, in the HTTP request component. If you go here we have done one error mapping, right? So it is now, we can see that the HTTP request in the parent flow is now throwing an exception. So which error, as we have the flow level error handler in this parent flow, which is public flow T. So as we have the flow level error handler, so this error handler is about to handle this error, right? So now let's see. If we move ahead, and we'll see that the type, if you see the current type, because though the timeout was it was a timeout exception, that is of type HTTP colon timeout, but as we have mapped that to the custom error, so now in the Mule debugger, if we see, the type is showing as the new value, where we have mapped the type. And if you see the on error continue error handler, which is at flow level of public flow T, there the type is mentioned as exactly the same, right? So that means this error handler would be able to handle this exception, right? So let's move ahead, and we'll see that it is being handled by this. So if you see, this is this error handler where the current debugger is showing, this is different thread. As I mentioned that the child flow execution was not complete, so that one is still getting completed, and as Mule debugger is not able to show you the two threads simultaneously, so that's the reason it is showing one by one. All right, so this is the current breakpoint, current debugger which you are seeing. This is the child flow. If you see, if you follow the flow name, this is the child flow, right? So we'll just move ahead, and we'll see that the control is now showing the flow, the execution of the parent flow. So now if you see, the debugger is there at the first event processor of the error handler, the flow level error handler in the parent flow, right? So now again it will go to the child flow, because the child flow execution is still not completed. So this is going to be completed now, because this is the last component in the error handling section of the child flow, right? So here now we can see that the child flow execution is now completed, and the parent flow execution is about to be completed. And if we see, this was the on error continue, and in the on error continue we have updated the payload using the set payload component in the error handler, right? So this is the latest payload, and we know that on error continue actually sends the success response. This actually on error continue sends the success response, and the status is going to be 200, right? So this is the payload which we are about to receive at the postman as response body, right? Though there is error object, but as we are handling the error using on error continue, that is the reason it is showing success it is sending success response. So let's see here. you can see that custom error handled and the status code is 200, right? So these were the demonstration. I have tried to explain most of the things. In case if you don't, if you have any other thing, if you have any question, I would request you to please comment on this. And as I was trying to cover most of the combinations, that's the reason the video is it has been a little bit lengthy. So I would request you to go through that, and in case of any question, please write it to me. Please do comment, and thank you.